Thank you, Richard, for the kind introduction. Good morning, all. I'm glad that you're all here. So I'm presiding over the morning session, which will set the stage a little bit. It will introduce the documents. It will introduce how they were found, how they have been studied until AI came into the picture. So there's 3 papers. The first paper will be given by Professor David Blank, who is a professor of classics and philosophy at the University of California, Los Angeles. His research interests lie primarily in ancient philosophy, rhetoric, grammar, and philology, and he now focuses on the Epicurean papyri from Herculaneum, especially those of Philodemus's rhetoric. The title of his paper I cannot see on the screen, so I will just read what is on the program and then he will give his actual title. The Herculaneum Papyri and their unrolling from 1754, Problems and Methods. Please join me in welcoming Professor Blank to the podium.
What is this? Give subtitles a try.
So, can I have the presenter view? Because otherwise I don't have a talk. It's all in the notes in the presenter view.
Oh, I see. It's there, yes. Is that kind of? I see. So they're there. No, that's not. That's the next slide.
Do you want this?
Probably, yes. Let's see, so that's the first one. So and that's the text. That's the text. That's all right.
If you go back to the title, maybe it will give you the...
Right. That's the next slide.
So then this is the touch screen, this slide. Oh, see? And that shows you what the next slide will be. So perhaps you could make the next slide smaller.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, let me...
No, that's fine. Well, what I want is to be able to read this.
So how's this?
Right. And that'll scroll as well, because some of it's going to be large.
It will, yeah, when you need.
Okay, right. Then I won't need glasses.
Sorry, I'm just getting used to the fact that I had my cataracts removed 3 weeks ago. So. So, as you can see, the title that I was asked to provide, but that didn't seem to make it into the program, is just a premonition of the kind of things that I'll be talking about, namely some various attempts to unroll the Herculaneum Papyri from the time that they were found until sometime in the 19th century. So we'll be talking a little bit then about quicksilver and chlorine and then also oxgut and the various ways in which these things were applied in order to unroll the papyri. So it turns out that the only library from the ancient world found with its books is in this sumptuous seaside villa at Herculaneum, buried in the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, and now known for its trove of about 800 papyrus rolls. The number is a matter of dispute and uncertainty, but somewhere around 800 is likely. And almost all of these rolls contain works of Epicurean philosophy, with a few Stoic books and a few very badly preserved Latin ones for good measure. The first notice to the learned world of the discovery of the papyrus rolls was this letter. No, that's not it. Was a letter from, sorry. Right, the first notice was a letter from the curator of the Herculaneum Antiquities, Camillo Paderni, to Dr. Mead, dated from Naples, November 18, 1752. And what I've illustrated here is a later hearsay account by a so-called learned Neapolitan gentleman, also published in the Philosophical Transactions. So there has been, he says, there has been found a great quantity of rolls, about half a palm long, and round, which appeared like roots of wood, all black and seeming to be only one piece. One of them falling on the ground, it broke in the middle, and many letters were observed, by which it was first known that the rolls were of papyrus. Oops. Another second-hand account comes from Father Piaggio's memoirs. In these memoirs, Piaggio says that people have told him that the papyri resembled fragments like charcoal, and they were thought to be just that. So they were ignored and left on the ground without even a glance. This was the fate of the first papyri, which had the bad luck, he says, to see the sky. But since in these fragments there was seen a consistently cylindrical shape and a similar size, workers were moved by curiosity to handle them. This was when they noticed the great thinness of the layers, their windings, and the friability of these masses, some of mud, others of charcoal. However, some thought they were rolls of burnt cloth. Others thought they were fishing or hunting nets, and so, broken by men's hands or by men's hoes, they were thrown back on the ground and there piled up and reburied, with no hope that they would ever be recovered. Piaggio then asks, wasn't this kind of diggers another reason why it would have been better had these papyri never been recovered? The curator, Piaggio says, loudly attributes to himself the eternal glory of having saved the remaining papyri from this misfortune. And there's no one to contest this, since the excavator Weber has gone. He asserts that having heard after a few days hushed rumors about this business, he had some pieces brought to him and recognized immediately from some letters. Piaggio then says in an aside, great powers of discrimination. So he recognized that of which the world had until then no inkling. And far from having had to take pains to recognize this, he adds that running immediately to the palace and having himself admitted, even at an early hour, to their majesties, and having opened one papyrus, that is, having slit it open with his knife, in their presence, he made them understand the value of the hidden treasures he had found. It's not advancing. Why isn't it advancing?
Is that what
It likes you better.
you said?
I don't blame it. Right, so when the rolls were first discovered, they were of little use to anyone. The first to be discovered at another site were burnt by workers in their home stoves or thrown into the sea. At least burning in home stoves is useful, I suppose.
No.
Badly carbonized and extremely fragile, the rolls could not be opened and read. Here you can see that there are many layers of papyrus that surround the umbilicus, the rod at the center that holds the roll together. And here's an engraving made from Piaggio's drawing of the appearance of the book rolls that he was shown but not allowed to operate on because they were in too good a condition, and Paderni wanted them for himself. So faced with these daunting lumps of coal, Paderni entertained various friends of the king who gave suggestions and even made experiments on papyrus rolls. One of these friends, the Principe di San Severo, figured that quicksilver, liquid mercury, would slide effortlessly between the layers of papyrus, allowing them to be separated. He built a box which would support a roll upright and allow him to pour mercury over it. Piaggio considered this a part of Paderni's butchery of the papyri, and he sketched it in his memoir of 1769, of which this is the relevant page. On 3 pages of this memoir, Piaggio quotes the story of the Prince of Sansevero's failure, as told him by Paderni, not without a great deal of schadenfreude. Il Signor Principe was able to arrange and to tell the story that their majesties allowed him to make his experiment, on behalf of which he said he was willing to bet all his estates, and that if he were in my place, I too would have risked what little I have in Rome, since by God's grace I still possess something there. I did everything I could to deter him from this mistake, since I know what I have done, and since what I have not been able to do myself, believe me, no one will be able to do. He had already said this, Piaggio adds, 50 times. So I had to give him the papyri he wanted. When one day he showed up here with this box of his and a bunch of tightly stoppered clay vases that I thought were liquids of various composition. All the more so since, as you see, I had done my own bit as well. He examined the papyri, chose one of the most round and of the best material, and then he stood the box upright, and inside it he secured the papyrus upright as well, using some silk below and around it to hold it in place. This being done, he took in hand one of the decanters. What did you think was inside it? It was full of quicksilver. This he began to pour slowly onto the upper surface of the papyrus, and behold, the quicksilver splashed here and there, and with its weight smashed the papyrus in 1,000 pieces. I won't tell you how Il Signor Principe turned around mortified. Some time had passed in preparing the box, in choosing the papyri, and he used that excuse that it was late, and said that the thing would absolutely ought to succeed, and therefore he would come back another time. He left me the other vases, which of course should have been filled with some substances different from the one already used, but actually they were all full of mercury. He returned the second time. The procedure was the same, except that he chose one of the loosest and lightest papyri. The success was the same again. Nor was there any other difference in the effect of the quicksilver, except that some little amount introduced itself into the fissures, where it either broke out or just remained there. The rest splashed away like the other time, where the leaves were more dense and impenetrable, breaking them into large pieces of bark, but not separating them one from another. He even said he wanted to return, which he did. The third test was to fill the whole box with quicksilver after another papyrus was placed in the center of the box with sufficient counterweight of silk and small pieces of wood, so that the papyrus would not float on the quicksilver. He emptied many decanters so that the box was full up to 2 fingers above the papyrus. He said he had to wait for the completion of the time during which the metal should imperceptibly do its work. He looked for a place to put it so that it could not be touched or exposed to some accident, and so he put it in my charge, entrusting it to me warmly. He returned after a few days, uncovered the papyrus, gently removing the metal, and this operation had the same result as the first ones. Finally, adhering steadfastly to his premise, he was reduced to suspending another papyrus in the air, and with the quicksilver in some incendiary devices he invented, made of glass, he placed under them a flame, which he caused to make smoke, having placed them in such a way that the smoke would rise to penetrate the papyrus. But nothing could be seen but smoke, which he commanded that we watch while standing far away and upwind. He placed the papyrus on the floor and, he placed the papyrus upright. No, he placed the papyrus on the floor, excuse me. He placed it upright, but nothing was visible other than smoke. And this was how the matter ended, with the papyrus having meanwhile been destroyed little by little as it was placed, now in one way, now in another. At this, I laughed like a crazy person, continued the curator. And standing behind the prince's back, I signaled to the queen. Her Majesty stood opposite him and could no longer stand it. But there occurred the most happy accident that she was holding her handkerchief to her mouth on account of the smoke. And so both of us had opportunity to laugh without the Principe being able to notice. In this way, were ruined, so many of the best of these papyri. But in any case, it was good for me and for my sons, because we inherited all this mercury, and mercury was valuable stuff. Paderni, as curator of the finds, had, of course, developed his own method, and he continued to use it to take a knife to the rolls, as he must have done with the first fragment he rushed to the king and queen to show them some writing. He cut them in half, and he emptied out their middles by crushing them with the butt end of his knife, so as to be able in each one to show a page of ancient writing to the king and friends. This process he called skinning, or scarnire. In his never-ceasing outrage against Paderni, Piaggio wrote, "Then, from the second wonderful and very abundant find of papyri, Paderni chose all those roundest and best turned in their shape, and whose material was of the best quality, things well known to him from the butchering of the first discovery. And before my very eyes he put them aside for himself, shut himself in a room for a long time in the mornings and during the day, coming to the museum for this purpose at dawn, and in the afternoon immediately after lunch. And he would still work by lamplight in the evening. And with his Genoese knife in hand, he turned them at his leisure into so many little boats, like those in Egypt, cutting them first from top to toe, emptying out their insides and eviscerating enough of them to find a flat leaf, broader than the others, toward the outside of the roll, which was legible or interesting, according to the oracle of the above-mentioned Don Nicola Ignara, assistant and great professor of things Greek. All the rest was reduced to powder and thrown into the toilet. These little boats did not see the light for a long time. After the departure of the Catholic king in 1759, no fewer than 14 boxes of these little boats were brought out, and these are currently on display to be shown to visitors. And thereby, I'm not sure whether the shamelessness in his face or the ignominy of such a great museum is the greater.
Yes.
So here's an end-on view of a papier-mâché model of a papyrus roll made by our very own Richard Janko. And it shows the cuts made into each side of the roll and the uncut middle, or midollo. Here's a top view of the same model. Lift off the top piece and then the bottom piece, and you get two hollow half cylinders and a thin central cylinder. And this was the result when, eventually, either because he was tired of scraping out the insides of his rolls, or, as Piaggio suggests, because he had trouble cutting all the way through them, Paderni would cut in on opposite sides of the roll and pull off two of what Piaggio referred to as barche, or Egyptian boats, leaving the central core intact. That is, two Egyptian boats and a core. So the barche, two of them, and a midollo. In some few cases, Piaggio himself pulled the outermost layer from such a piece of bark and copied it and stored it glued to stiff paper. And some of these copies have ended up among the drawings now housed in Oxford. Later, starting in the 1820s, the boats or half-boats would later be copied and scraped off layer by layer from the inside down to the bottom, which destroyed all but the last layer. In 1753, between the two discoveries of papyri, Giuseppe Assemani, curator and expert on early Christian manuscripts at the Vatican Library, and also by royal appointment chronicler of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, convinced the king to request that the Vatican send someone to assist with the unrolling of the papyri. And for that job, he already had someone in mind, namely the Genoese father Antonio Piaggio delle Scuole Pie, whom he recommended as the only man alive who could succeed in it. A distinguished and ingenious restorer of illuminated manuscripts in the Vatican Library, Piaggio arrived in Naples in early July of 1753, where the curator Camillo Paderni made clear to him that he was unwelcome. Piaggio became the hero of the early history of the papyri, and this portrait by Achille Iovine was hung in the museum in 1854 by royal command. Opposed to the summoning of help from the Vatican, the curator Paderni showed Piaggio on his first visit to the Museo a large box, locked with a large bolt and with a large key, and that contained what both men considered useless lumps of carbonized papyrus, illustrated here by Piaggio in his memorial of 1769. Eventually, Piaggio was given the task of working on the central midolli of the rolls he had cut open, or rather that Paderni had cut open. Paderni considered these cylinders useless, since if you cut them in two, then they would yield only a small surface if cut open, and that would have been the way he had been working with the other rolls. Piaggio then invented his famous machine, the macchina, which allowed him to unroll the midolli, at least some of the best of them, continuously. Now, the first notice of Piaggio's work using his macchina on the papyri from the mathematical box in which the midolli were stored comes from Paderni's letter to Sir Thomas Robinson of 25 October 1754. The canonico Mazzocchi, he says, who is much esteemed for his learning and knowledge of antiquity, is employed in copying and explaining 5 entire columns that have been lately unrolled off one of the papyri, which gives some hopes of further discoveries. This manuscript treats of music and poetry. And you can see here, so this is the papyrus roll sitting in these hooks. There are then these bands, fabric bands here that hold it, that can lift it. And then it's meant to be brought up here and re-rolled on this rod. And so here's, again, an imagined reconstruction of what this process might have looked like. Here's a less well-known drawing of Piaggio's macchina. It was made by the Danish professor and bishop Friedrich Münter when he visited Piaggio in the museum at Portici in October 1785. On a first visit, Münter described the state of the papyrus workshop in the museum. September 1785, Father Antonio, the inventor of the contraption, is disgusted by the work. Currently, Merli is working on it. 4 rolls are unrolled, as they were 30 years ago. Antonio would rather make handkerchiefs than do further work on it. And he has described in code the history of the discoveries and of the troubles and discomforts he has endured. Then Münter made his second visit in October. The most important thing, he says, is the sketch of the machine for unrolling the manuscripts that I made on this occasion. 5 of the manuscripts are unrolled. 1 is pretty much whole, but the others are so full of holes that when they're ready, they can hardly be read. The man who copies or draws them doesn't know 1 word of Greek and can therefore do as many as he likes. J.H. Bartels, a friend of his, quotes from the letter of his friend Münter. The whole method used is as follows. Once the beginning of the papyrus has been found, the roll placed on the hooks and the silk threads fastened around it, one smears the part that is to be unrolled with gum and applies very small and fine bits of gold beater's skin. This is the oxgut membrane of my title today. So the gold beater's skin were applied then where there are breaks in the papyrus so that the whole is held together. Then one gradually pulls the sheet from the roll using the threads and lowering the brass hooks, and obtains a variegated and very lacunose mass on which one recognizes only individual letters. I was unable to make out a single word. When the papyrus finished unrolling on the first versions of Piaggio's machine, it was rolled up backwards on the rod at the top.
That's up here.
It was then taken off and stored. Giambattista Malesci was the second person to draw this papyrus, which is on flattery. And this was the fourth papyrus unrolled on the macchina, and Piaggio himself drew two drawings of the last columns in 1761-2. The whole papyrus was still stored on a stick in 1782 when Piaggio's inventory was made, and Malesci drew it as he saw it, one continuous length of papyrus. Later versions of Piaggio's machine drew the leading edge of the papyrus up using silk threads attached to wooden knurled screws. Each time it reached the top of the frame, it was then cut with a sharp knife, drawn and stored. Now that we've seen something of attempts to open papyri, let's go back in time a bit. Father Piaggio died in 1796, having opened 17 papyri together with his assistant Merli. In 1798, the royal family took shelter in the second capital, Palermo, to escape the Jacobins of the Parthenopean Revolution, at least one of whom was Pasquale Baffi, professor of Greek paleography, who was working to edit 4 Herculaneum Papyri. The papyri were shipped off to accompany the king. However, the boxes in which they were sent off were never opened, and as the revolution had been put down in 1799, and its leaders, including Baffi, were hanged in the market square, the boxes of papyri were returned to Baiae in January of 1802. And their return was awaited at Portici by John Hayter, the canon in ordinary to the Prince Regent of Great Britain, later George IV, who was granted permission to organize anew the work of the Officina dei Papyri and financed by the Prince Regent himself. Hayter worked in Portici from January of 1802 until the imminent arrival of Napoleon's army in February 1806. After reluctantly allowing a chemist, Gaetano Lapira, to experiment on some papyrus fragments with vegetable gas, as he calls it, which atomized them, Hayter set to work himself. He learned from 3 of Piaggio's workers the art of unfolding the book rolls. Then he took on 10 new men, including 2 draftsmen, Giuseppe Casanova and Carlo Orazzi. And then he put the spurs to the workings of the officina, assigning both an unroller and a draftsman to each roll to be unrolled. Hayter selected rolls for unrolling. As he says, whenever the small brush which they wetted and applied, in this case to the outside surface of the manuscript, whenever this brush caused the exterior fold to raise itself singly in a detached state from the next layer under it, that manuscript most completely justified the experiment, however simple, by a more entire separation of each fold in the volume, especially from the middle part, even to the end, and by a more entire preservation of letters, both in form and in color. Such promising rolls could then be fastened with silk threads to the machine of Piaggio, and unrolled by tightening the threads very gradually, while loosening the outermost layer of papyrus with a fine needle, and supporting the material where it was weak by gluing gold beater skin to the back of it. Each segment of papyrus was then given to the draftsman to copy. The draftsman's drawing was checked by an academic who knew Greek, and a fee of 1 carlino was recorded as payment to both the unroller and the copyist for each complete line correctly transcribed. Since Hayter paid each man a monthly salary that he knew was wholly inadequate to live on, each man had an incentive to complete as much as they could, and also to push his partner to greater achievement. Then the drawing was assigned to an engraver, who made the copper plates which would eventually be printed when the papyrus was published. Under Hayter's direction, the Officina unrolled over 200 book roll cores in less than 4 years, which is quite an increase over the 17 unrolled in the 44 years of the Officina's first incarnation. Once Hayter went off to Palermo, he got into a spot of difficulty with the local authorities, something about a rather young novice nun found in his hotel room. And persona non grata had to return to England. Oops. Despite the relative success of Piaggio's machine, in the early 19th century, others thought they could improve on the method. And one such was the Thuringian ancient historian Friedrich Karl Ludwig Sickler, who offered his services to unroll the papyri, which had been given to the Prince Regent, using a new method. Sickler had the idea to make an unrolling machine similar to that of Piaggio, but instead of attaching silk threads to the leading edge of the papyrus to help it come off the roll, he used a glue of his own devising to attach linen or cotton cloth to the papyrus, which he would then separate from the roll by hand. It appears that Sickler succeeded only in destroying 7 of the 9 papyri he worked on, since his glue penetrated multiple layers of papyrus at one time, so that, at best, the small pieces he was able to pull off were a farrago of many layers stuck together. One member of the commission overseeing Sickler's work was the distinguished chemist Sir Humphrey Davy. Davy's experiments and demonstrations with nitrous oxide had won him notoriety and begun a popular party fad. Here is James Gilray's cartoon of one such demonstration to the Royal Institution. A young Humphrey Davy, that's him here, gleefully works the bellows in this caricature of experiments with laughing gas at the Royal Institution. The lecturer is Thomas Garrett, Davy's predecessor as professor of chemistry. Benjamin Thompson, Count Rumford, stands at the door, while on the left, the unfortunate guinea pig breathes in the gas and farts away. Oops. Davy made experiments on some fragments of Herculaneum Papyri in England in 1818. Chlorine and iodine, it is well known, he writes, have no action upon pure carbonaceous substances and a strong attraction for hydrogen. And it occurred to me that these bodies might with propriety be used in attempting to destroy the matter which caused the adhesion of the leaves, without the possibility of injuring the letters on the papyri, since ancient ink was made of charcoal. I made some experiments upon them by exposing them to the action of chlorine and the vapor of iodine, heating them gently after the process. These trials all afforded more or less hopes of success. When a fragment of a brown manuscript, in which the layers were strongly adherent, was placed in an atmosphere of chlorine, there was an immediate action. The papyrus smoked and became yellow, and the letters appeared much more distinct, and by the application of heat, the layers separated from each other, giving off fumes of muriatic acid. Davy's first visit to Naples was a brief one, on which he reported to his student Michael Faraday, yes, that Faraday, from Rome on the 12th of February, 1819. He experimented on 2 brownish rolls, one Greek and one Latin, the latter very much a congealed mass due to its penetration by muddy water, and that made it unsuitable for Piaggio's machine. Davy returned to Naples in December of 1819. He wanted to use a number of papyri to see which chemical methods would work best on pieces preserved in different conditions. His long-term request was to unroll all of the papyri just enough for scholars to determine their content and their interest. So remember that the Epicurean papyri were thought by most people, including Winkelmann, to be a great disappointment. So presumably, they would have been thrown away. In January, Monsignor Rosini reported to the Secretary of State that Davy's experiments were succeeding in unrolling some papyri in part, but the newly unrolled pieces had lost their writing. Rossini was cooperating with the royal command given him, but was clearly suspicious of Davy and his methods. Davy left Naples in February. So the problem of stratification, that is, of multiple layers coming off the roll at once, afflicts these papyri that I'm showing you, unrolled by Davy. So that the whole piece resembles a Cocker Spaniel is purely coincidental. Davy also thought that the oxgut membrane being used in the officina to glue onto and reinforce papyrus as it was unrolled penetrated too many layers, sticking them permanently together. To obviate this objection, he says, I mixed the solution of glue with a sufficient quantity of alcohol to gelatinize it, and a mixture of the jelly and fluid being made and applied by a camel's hair brush, a film of jelly remained on the exterior of the surface of the leaf, which attached itself to the membrane. The first papyrus unrolled on Piaggio's machine was number 1497, which carried the last part of the text of the fourth book of Philodemus' On Music. It was cut up into manageable lengths and stored in gilt wooden frames under glass so that it could be shown off to visitors. The other papyri unrolled by Piaggio and Merli remained wound up backwards on the roller sticks until the reopening of the Officina dei Papyri under Hayter, when they were cut up into smaller lengths, mounted on paper, and stored. Later, they were displayed on the walls of the papyrus room of the Archaeological Museum. There was a plan to cut up all the papyri in the manner of On Music 4. Piaggio wrote a long plea that at least one papyrus, the second book on rhetoric, be preserved in its full length, that is, the full length of its last part, the earlier columns having been cut off by Paderni. It is over 2 meters in length, and here is just the first half, glued onto canvas, then framed with construction paper to make the edges prettier, and housed in a specially built wooden cabinet. The handy-sized pieces of papyrus, once cut up, were framed as if pictures, and were eventually displayed, as I said, on the walls of the papyrus room of the Archaeological Museum. In the case of a piece of bark from the external layers of the book roll, the interior uppermost layer was copied, then scraped off, so that the layer underneath it could be copied. These drawings were eventually, in most cases, published, whereby the fragments were numbered in the order they were copied, so that the succession of their texts is not only discontinuous, but also in reverse order. And this was only reversed in the invention of the Delattre-Aubing method of reconstruction. The most recent efforts at unrolling Herculaneum papyri, the so-called Oslo method, were carried out from 1983 until about 1997 by Knut Kleve and Brynjulf Fosse. They took papyrus rolls, such as P. Herc Paris II, and observed them carefully to find pieces on the exterior of the roll that could be taken off by moistening them with astringent alcohol and lifting them with tweezers, then gluing them onto squares of Japanese paper. Before lifting these pieces, they photographed the entire surface of the roll and noted the location and shape of the pieces they would lift off. Then they photographed the pieces mounted on Japanese paper. By this process, hundreds of pieces were taken off the papyrus roll, which are now being patiently pieced together virtually by a team led by Daniel Delattre in Paris. Here we see at the bottom the photo taken by the unrollers to show the location of the bits they would lift from it. At the top, we see part of the new reconstruction of individual bits by the Paris team. Now, with micro-CT scanning and machine learning, we may hope to be able to read papyri like these before long without cutting them into bits. Thank you.
So we have some time for just one or two quick questions. So we have some time for one or two questions before we go to the next speaker. So I don't know whether there is a question. Yes, please.
Have they ever tried to reconstruct this in the hypothetical window, the pressure is reduced. Is that throughout this whole
Not to my knowledge, at any rate. I mean, people have come up with various ideas. I was contacted by some people in California once who had their own gas that they wanted to use, and perhaps also some controlled pressure. It's obvious that the pressure might have some effect because, as we saw, Davy, for example, was using heated air in order to separate the rolls, and so that would cause a pressure differential as well. But no, not as far as I know.
One more question? Yes, please. And there is a microphone, I think, people had this here.
Thank you for that great presentation, and also heartbreaking.
Yes, the sad part.
You talked by saying there were maybe 800 scrolls ultimately in the collection, but it's hard to count. If you had to add up all of the ones that were destroyed against all the ones that finally made it through or were discovered in the first place, what kind of percentage are we talking about? Did we lose maybe half of them, or do you have an estimate of that?
Not really. The sources aren't very good about that. And this is in part, of course, because of the rivalry between Piaggio and Paderni. So Piaggio constantly wants to emphasize that Paderni ruined a lot of rolls, but also totally destroyed a lot of them. Then there's the whole question of those rolls which were burned in people's ovens or just reburied. So I suppose that when we think about the fact that that the vast majority of the rolls now came from the library room, room 5 on Weber's plan, and that those tend to be these philosophical papyri, it's quite probable that the rolls that were discovered in 1852 and destroyed at that time may well have been non-philosophical papyri of another sort. People often don't think about that possibility when they say, oh, well, there's possibly another library in the villa. Well, maybe there still is, but then again, maybe there was and no longer is. So I don't know a percentage, but maybe it was half. It's hard to say.
Thank you. Let's thank the speaker again.